What's up, team? Phil Nash from Coach's Digest here to talk today about first principles based program design. Now, this is a part of a series of presentations about applying mental models to the field of human performance. Essentially, my goal as a coach is to be wrong less. Working in a complex environment like we do, working with human beings every day, we can use mental models as tools to improve how we think, ultimately with the goal of being wrong less. And that's entirely what this program is about, applying first principles to program design. So the learning objective of this presentation is to first learn what first principles are, then review some of the major first principles of strength conditioning, and then finally practically apply this model to our program design process. So first, let's level set and just define what first principles are. I love this quote from Shane Parrish, which is in a Farnam Street article, totally around first principles. And the full article is linked in the description of this video. But Shane Parrish says, a first principle is a foundational proposition or assumption that stands alone. We cannot deduce first principles from any other proposition or assumption. So simply put, it's the foundation to our knowledge on a given topic. And I love the analogy of first principles being the roots to our proverbial tree of understanding, right? The more our knowledge is rooted or based in first principles, well, then the larger and stronger our tree of understanding can grow. And I think this quote from Richard Feynman, the American theoretical physicist, and honestly one of the best thinkers of his time, he also created the Feynman technique, which is definitely something that we'll talk about in the future. But this quote definitely sums up what can happen if our knowledge isn't rooted in these first principles. And he says, I don't know what's the matter with people. They don't learn by understanding, they learn by some other way, by rote or something. Their knowledge is so fragile. So if we don't understand first principles, then we don't truly know why we're doing what we're doing. I think one of the best examples of this is thinking about the current state of the diet and weight loss industry right now, right? If our understanding isn't based on first principles, right? So it's not based on caloric restriction, which is ultimately based on the law of thermodynamics representing the first principle, well, then we're susceptible to falling for bullshit, right? But if I understand the first principle of thermodynamics, well, then I can leverage any diet, right? Whether it's low carb, high carb, vegan, whatever it is, as a tool to help someone reach their body composition goals, right? Because now my knowledge is based in first principles, right? It's based in the law of thermodynamics. I understand how fat loss works, right? How body recomposition works. So from there, I can choose different strategies that help me get to that goal of caloric restriction and then ultimately weight loss. So now let's start to apply these principles or this concept of first principles thinking to human performance. So these represent a pretty complete list of principles as it relates to strength conditioning. These are coming directly from the scientific principles of strength training. It's a book that I highly recommend from the folks at Renaissance Periodization and Juggernaut Training Systems. And while the book is specific to powerlifting, these represent principles of training to induce a specific adaptation, so they really easily can be extrapolated out to really any other goal that we might see within human performance. But for the sake of this presentation, we're going to focus on specificity and overload as they represent the most pivotal and important principles of training that set up everything else we do in our program design. But again, highly recommend picking up this book as it takes a super deep dive into all the principles here you see on the screen. So let's start with specificity. And specificity comes first because it sets the foundation for all the other principles, right? It gives our program design direction, right? By specifically reverse engineering the goal to guide everything else we do in our training to work towards reaching that specific desired endpoint, right? And this principle of specificity states that the way the body adapts to training is specific to the stimulus placed on it, right? So i.e., if I want to get stronger at the bench press, well, then I'm going to have to train with heavy loads in the specific pattern of the bench press, right? But sadly, like most things in life, and especially most things in the human body, it's not that simple, right? And specificity ultimately is going to exist on a spectrum from the most specific thing to the least specific, and even past that to things that actually might be so non-specific that they ultimately harm performance, right? They harm our ability or take away from our ability to reach our specific end goal. So let's look at the spectrum of specificity, right? And again, the book, Scientific Principles of Strength Training, is written for powerlifting, so let's just stick and ride with that example, right? So the goal of powerlifting, probably oversimplified, don't get mad at me, powerlifters, but essentially I'm trying to get someone stronger in the 1 rep max squat, bench, and deadlift, right? So I'm driving up their 1 rep squat, bench, and deadlift. That way on their competition day, maybe they hit PRs, but at the very least they're hitting high numbers in each of those 3 lifts, right? So what's the most specific thing we can do to squat, bench, and deadlift, right? Well, it's going to be improving at the lifts heavy, right? So I'm training the lifts heavy. Then from there, thinking about things that have a positive transfer on performance in the sport, but again, not necessarily the actual thing. So in this case, this could be hypertrophy training, right? Knowing that if I can make someone or improve someone's amount of muscle mass that they have, well, that a larger muscle is potentially or has the potential to be a stronger muscle, right? So maybe that's a limiting factor for someone, right? They can increase their muscle mass, and then over time, we can then quote unquote teach that muscle to produce more force, thus having a positive impact on squat, bench, and deadlift. Then as we move further away, we can look at something like flexibility training, right? So these are going to be things that are mostly tangential to performance, right? But in this case, flexibility training could be a performance enhancer, right? Especially if someone is lacking the required range of motion to efficiently and effectively perform a specific lift like squat, bench, or deadlift. And then finally, again, now we're getting to things that are so non-specific that they actually can have a negative impact on our performance, right? So for a powerlifter, especially as they get closer and closer and closer to their meet, excessive endurance training can actually be harmful to performance, right? And this can be due to a number of things, right? It could be due to morphological and physiological changes, but honestly, most simply, it can drive excessive fatigue, right? And this can take away from our ability to actually perform in training, or our ability to adapt from the training, right, of the main thing, right? So that excessive stress that we're placing on the body, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about overload in a second, but can actually take away from our body's ability to adapt from the main thing, right? Training the lifts heavy. So let's get into overload. Right, and within overload, again, definitions coming straight from Scientific Principles of Strength Training, and they say that we can say that a training stimulus, whether it's exercise, rep, set, or session, presents overload when the stimulus is within the maximal threshold of the adaptive system and the stimulus is on average greater than recent historical stimuli. So basically what it's saying is that our training should get more challenging over time, right? And really what we're trying to do is hit that Goldilocks zone, right? So our training needs to fall within this nice, neat bandwidth, right? Where it's not too much, where it's past the point of our body's ability to recover, and not too little, where it's not stressful enough to drive adaptation, right? And my personal bias as a coach, especially spending a ton of time working with athletes and working with the general population, in both cases, my bias is going to be to err on the side of caution, right? So I'd rather undershoot than overshoot, knowing that we can always make our training more challenging over time, right? I'd rather have the first week of training or first 2 weeks of training be not super stressful and you can easily adapt to it, right? Knowing that we can always progress the volume or intensity or whatever we're chasing over time. And yes, in the real world, we're constantly exposed to different forms of stress and training and work and life. And along with this, our ability to recover is going to be constantly in flux based on sleep, nutrition, genetic factors, and a whole host of other factors and some things that we're probably not even thinking about. And because of this, we don't adapt in that perfect straight line, right, that theory presents. And that's okay, right? It doesn't mean that progressive overload is useless. It just represents a model that's ultimately imperfect, but extremely useful for us as coaches, right? All we want to see is that at the end of a mesocycle or 1 month or one phase of training, or more importantly, at the end of a macro cycle, right? So multiple phases of training stacked together, that the trend line is pointing in the direction that we want to go, right? So all we want to see as we look back on our month or months of training that we've made progress towards the specific goal that we're shooting for. So let's put these two principles together, right? And essentially, putting them together, we adapt to better handle the specific stress repeatedly placed on us over time. And my favorite example of this is what I call the marathon problem, right? And I am far from a distance runner. And if I went out and ran a marathon right now, well, I would probably die. But if I made it through that, my body would be destroyed, right? Absolutely in shambles. And there's no amount of sleep or nutrition or, cryo, cold plunge, hot tub, whatever that's going to allow me to feel better, right? But if I progressively increase my running volume over the course of multiple months or over the course of a year, well, then I'd be able to complete the race, right? Because we adapt to better handle the specific stress that's repeatedly placed on us over time. So now let's take all this nice, neat theory and actually apply it to designing a full program. So at Exos, we love to start our education with coaches talking about systems versus methods, right? And a method represents a singular way of doing something. And methods are sensitive to change over time, and the best method today might not be the best method tomorrow, right? And some examples of methods in strength training might be 5-3-1 or conjugate or cube method for some of my strength training OGs out there. But simply put, they're tools that we have at our disposal, right? But they're far from a great tool for every single scenario, right? If all we have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And at Exos, we utilize a system, right, or a systems-based approach. And a system is simply a coordinated body of methods forming a complex whole, right? And systems are going to be resilient to change over time because our system and systems in general are based in first principles, right? And because I understand principles, well, then I can better organize the tools that I have at my disposal based on the stimulus that they put on the body. And then from here, I can choose and more importantly, modify any method to meet the specific context that I'm working in. So when we're thinking about how first principles apply to program design, right? When you go to design your program, I like to think about first principles being the guardrails, right? Or being the bumpers on the bowling alley, right? The pins are the desired adaptation that we're ultimately shooting for, right? If I knock down the pins, then I've done a great job in specifically improving someone's ability to do the thing they want to do, right? The ball is our training program, right? So no matter how we release the ball or the environment of the lane, I know if I'm utilizing first principles thinking when I'm designing my program, I have those bumpers up, it's going to point me in the direction of the desired adaptation or the pins. So let's zoom out for a second and take a look at the program design process. So if I was to design a mesocycle for someone, I would first define the goal of the training phase, right? So what's the goal of the training phase? How long is the training phase, right? What's our outcome goal here? What will they be able to do or look like or whatever at the end of the cycle, right? Then I'm going to identify and assess the relevant capacities of the person or people that I'm working with, right? So cool. Identify what's important. We're going to be my KPIs, and then test them, right? Then from there, let's define some practical limitations, right? So time, space, equipment access, anything that could practically impact my ability to implement a program. And then from there, the two things that we're going to talk about heavily are going to be design the plan and then refine the plan over time. So designing the plan, I actually sit down and create the plan, and then five, and my favorite and the unsung hero of this whole process, but I refine the plan over time, right? I like to think about these plans being written in pencil, right? Knowing that we're going to have to make changes on the fly based on how our athletes, our clients are responding, and probably based on some practical limitations that we weren't thinking of when we sat and designed our program. So let's take some time here to look at two super common but very different goals, right? So we have a body recomposition goal, right, where the goal is to lose fat and gain, or more likely maintain the lean mass that we have. And then we have a performance enhancement goal, right? We want to improve physical abilities specific to their position in soccer. So it could be speed, it could be endurance, it could be agility, or it could be improving the range of movement options that we can perform, right? So allowing someone to be better at shuffling, at cutting, at changing a direction in general. So from a specificity standpoint, let's look at body recomp first, right? So the most specific thing to the body recomposition goal would be performing movements in a rep range that supports muscle growth or supports the maintenance of lean muscle mass, right? So understanding that hypertrophy can happen in a wide variety of intensities, in a wide variety of rep ranges, all based on proximity to failure, right? So as long as I'm training in that range, then my training is going to be specific to that goal. Now, beyond this, looking at a level deeper or a level further away, a level less specific, right? We can look at movement technique, right? Potentially playing an important role in the ability to perform movements over full ranges of motion. So maybe mobility training for this individual actually becomes somewhat of a specific input because they might be lacking specific range of motion, right? So for example, if they lack range of motion at the ankle, at the hip, right, and they can't perform full range of motion squats or lunges at heavy loads, well, then that might impact their ability to train hard enough to gain or maintain lean muscle mass. Now, there's always going to be workarounds, right? I could just do leg extensions, right, and kind of forego or bypass that mobility limitation. But generally speaking, if I can improve their range of motion or improve their technical abilities, well, then I can improve the loads they can use over those full ranges of motion. Now, zooming out even further, now looking at things that might be so non-specific that they impact this body recomposition goal. And one of the big ones is excessive endurance training, right? So while some endurance training is always going to be great for everyone from like an overall health standpoint, an excessive amount in this case could negatively impact hypertrophy training. And again, this could be from excessive stress, right, and impacting their ability to recover, or again, excessive stretch and impacting their ability to do the main thing, right? If I'm so fatigued from my endurance training, well, then that might impact my force outputs or the intensity that I bring or the intent that I bring to each lift because I'm already so fatigued. Now switch gears a little bit, flip to the other side and look at the performance enhancement goal, right? So in sport, the most specific thing is always going to be playing and practicing your sport, right? So if I'm working with a midfielder in soccer, the most specific thing that athlete could do is play their position in their sport, right? But now from here, looking at things that are a little bit less specific than that and something that I have control over as a coach, well, now this might look like training speed and endurance, right? So two things that are going to have a positive transfer to the sport that are both important qualities for a soccer player, right? So let's say in this case, their goal is to get faster, right? They feel like they've lost a step. Well, sweet. Now speed training becomes the most specific thing that I can control as a strength coach or a performance coach in my training, right? So that's going to be the major goal. That's the number one priority is getting them faster on the pitch, right? Now from here, something related to that, right, but still pretty tangential to the sport is going to be getting stronger, right? So improving their ability to produce maximal amounts of force, right? So I'm increasing their ceiling of force production potential, right? Knowing that if I can do that and also have them jump, sprint, things like that, well, then that's going to hopefully, in theory, allow them to put more force into the ground, which will in turn allow them to run faster, right? And hopefully all of this transfers to the pitch, right? Transfers to them actually playing their sport, right? So it could be strength, it could be rate of force development, so I could be doing Olympic lift variations, I could be doing jumps and bounds and things like that, right? But all these things are going to improve their ability to put force into the ground, right? And now zooming all the way out and looking at something that's so non-specific that I actually could negatively impact performance, we could look at something like hypertrophy training, right? So especially in season, hypertrophy could have a negative effect on performance. Again, it could be some morphological or some physiological changes, but thinking even more simply than that, again, driving excess fatigue, knowing that if I want to train and improve speed, to train and improve maximal force production, to train and improve rate of force production, well, then I need to do that in a relatively fresh state. Excuse me. And if I'm overemphasizing hypertrophy training or overemphasizing high volume training, well, that could negatively impact my ability to recover and thus perform at a high level when I actually want to do the main thing in my training, right? The most specific thing, which is going to be sprinting in this case, right? So moving on from specificity to overload, right? How can we apply overload in every program that we write? And in both cases, as we talked about earlier, we want to see that trend line of progress moving forward, knowing that it's going to ebb and flow from the days to the weeks, but generally speaking, when we look from the start to the end, we want to see that trend line pointing up towards adaptation, right? The positive adaptation that we're looking for. Right, so this means that our program needs to get progressively more challenging over time to stimulate further adaptation. Right, and we can monitor training through subjective and objective means to decide if we're putting too much or too little stimulus on a person, and then from there we can make changes to our program. Over longer periods of time, we can assess to see if they're adapting to training in the specific way we run, right? So am I making changes in my body composition? Am I getting faster in a 20-meter sprint? Right, and again, based on how they're responding, we can either stick to the plan or we can make changes to our exercise selection, our sets, our reps, our loading parameters, all to elicit the specific adaptation that we're shooting for. So for both scenarios, we can write 5 completely different programs that equally adhere to the principles of specificity and overload, right? Principles allow us to choose the method based on who we're working with and when we're working with them, their schedule, and what we have access to, and a number of other factors, right? There are a million different methods for getting strong, right? Whether it's 5x5, 5-3-1, conjugate, wave loading, etc. But if I know why I'm getting someone stronger, again, specificity, what's the end goal? I can choose the method that makes the most sense for them in this specific context, right? Then I can make changes to the specific method, again, based on how they respond to the program to ensure that I'm progressively overloading them over time. So here's a list of awesome resources. Some on first principles thinking, and some are how we can apply this approach to training. Again, all these are going to be linked in the description of this video, and these kind of make up the inspiration for this presentation for me. So if you like this video or you just want to say what's good, hit my email, thecoachesdigest@gmail.com, or my IG at Nashville. And as always, like, comment, share, and subscribe, and I will catch y'all next time. Peace.